Great. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Michael Greenwald. I'm Deputy Director of the North America Trilateral Commission, and we're so thrilled to have Morgan Ortagus, my dear friend, spokesperson for the State Department, and Secretary Mike Pompeo with us today. We wanted to have Morgan speak to this group back in March in Washington pre-COVID, and so we're so thrilled, Morgan, that you have agreed to join us, I believe, less than a month before you give birth. So thank you so much for being with us this morning.
It can happen any moment. I can do it by call with all of you.
Maybe that will be the October surprise. But Morgan, I know our time is limited today, so this is going to be the first of many conversations we're going to do with the DRF, so the Trilateral Commission. And so you are our first speaker of this COVID series. So Morgan, thank you again. So let's just jump right in. Morgan, talk to us about your role as spokesperson and a little bit about how that's changed since you started.
Well, gosh, what a year and a half it's been. First of all, just to say thanks for having me, Michael. It's great to get out and to tell my story and the story of what we're doing. I'm sure you have a lot of, women that are listening in. So I think it's the one thing that the pregnancy has taught me is that you can have a high-powered job and be pregnant and have kids. It's been a little crazy trying to do it. So normally I travel with Secretary Pompeo wherever he is around the world. He left for Japan yesterday. He's en route there right now, actually. So if I wasn't 34 weeks pregnant, I would be on that trip with him and not speaking to all of you. So I actually traveled around the world with him until just a few weeks ago, until 30 weeks. And then all the doctors kicked me off the plane and said I wasn't able to do it. So it's certainly been a really, really interesting year and a half. You know, when you're in these sorts of jobs, it's sort of, it's like being an emergency room doctor. There's something always going on around the world. Even if it's sort of quiet from a foreign policy front on the United States, we have things like, Azerbaijan and Armenia, Belarus, I mean, you name it, right? I could go into every region of the world and pick a hot spot where something is burning and something that we're dealing with. I would say, I sort of take it all in stride because every day that I wake up, I get up pretty early, 5:30 every day. There's some sort of crisis around the world waiting on me for when I wake up. I always say out of everything I've dealt with, I did not have global pandemic on my bingo card. So that's been a very interesting way. So we've had to adjust, like everybody else, right? Like all of you, we're speaking virtually. So we try to do something in person at the State Department with the media at least once a week, but a lot of them have been very hesitant about coming in too. So we also, we do a ton of stuff over the phone, a ton of briefings on the phone, stuff over video, whatever we are able to do. I still do a lot of international media. So some of the stuff has stayed the same. I just say that we have undergone the same transformation that every other business and person has gone through to try to push our content online. And, hopefully it's working. So we'll see. Does that answer your question, Michael?
It does. And I'm just curious. I mean, I keep thinking, how do you think your role as spokesperson to the Secretary of State, how do you think that's changed over time with now? I mean, you're on Twitter constantly. The forms of communication continue to change. Talk to a little bit us about that.
That's an interesting question. So I think everything about the spokesperson role depends on the Secretary of State and how that particular secretary decides to utilize a spokesperson role. I've been very lucky. When I came back into the administration, so Michael and I worked together. This is my third administration. Michael and I worked together in the Obama administration, actually. And so when I came back in from the private sector, I initially wasn't sure. I'm like, I don't know that I want to do a spokesperson role. I'm an intel and policy person. But Mike Pompeo had a very different vision for what he wanted a spokesperson to be. And he, really wanted someone that was helping him communicate policy and in on those decisions. I'm a big believer that to be effective at policy, at communications, at whatever you're doing in government, you need to have a vast array of experiences. And if you don't know how to communicate policy, if you don't know how to sell what you're doing, then I don't think you're effective on the policy side. So I've been lucky. Obviously, I'm not traveling at the moment given my condition, but I've been really lucky that on most trips around the world with him, and I've been traveling with him for over a year and a half straight. He's brought me into his meetings. We have discussions. He's never looked at me as like, oh, the comms person. We talk about everything from whatever the policy decision is to how we're going to communicate it to what's the intel saying. So whomever is Secretary of State next, Secretary's always said if the president wins, he'd like to, stay on, but eventually there will be another one, whether there's a new person in January, February, or in a couple of years from now, there'll be a new Secretary of State. And so I think that this role is very dependent. You can have it. I know some of my predecessors, without naming names, had situations where they didn't really have access to their secretary and they weren't in the inner circle. And I just don't know how you do the job without knowing what your boss thinks, without knowing how your boss thinks to other foreign leaders. So I'll just say that I feel like I have been lucky in that sense that the secretary has always been very good to me in terms of making sure that I'm a part of the policy process. Everything is obviously, so much more on Twitter. I mean, you can see sometimes my counterparts in China and Russia, and I go at it a little bit on Twitter. But
I've seen that. Yes, it's
very strategic when we do it. It's not like sort of I get bored and I just or I get in a mood and I tweet at my Chinese counterparts. It's everything that we do, everything that we say, even if we're getting in a Twitter fight, it's very deliberate.
And I mean, Morgan, you and I met right before you were headed to Saudi Arabia as the Deputy Treasury Attaché. And coming from the intel world, I mean, you spent some time in Iraq before this. How do you see your role, but also intersecting with the intelligence that you receive? I mean, without going into too much detail, how does that work? Because you're communicating publicly, but you're also part of very sensitive conversations.
That's true. So, and I'd say that's one of the more frustrating parts, Michael, is, sometimes you want to say something to a reporter, to the American people, and they have it totally wrong, but you can't say it, because it's classified or because there's privacy reasons or certain things. So sometimes that is, incredibly, frustrating. And, you always have to, you always have to shape things through a way in which that you can get the story out to the American people, out to the world, to explain what's going on. But you also have to protect, obviously, this, Michael, you were in Intel for a long time, sources and methods and what may be going on behind the scenes. So sometimes if it seems like we're being evasive, we're really not trying to be, right? Sometimes you just legitimately have things going on where you just can't talk about, and it's not even necessarily always intelligence. Sometimes it's like things that seem a little mundane, like visa issues. Like sometimes, we have people that will tweet or go to the newspaper, say, I've been denied a visa from the United States. And there's a whole backstory that I could never tell, not even on background or off the record, nothing. And so sometimes we take hits that we have to take just because, for privacy reasons. And you think, well, it is what it is, right? You can't win everything.
No, I can imagine it can be frustrating at times. So we've got the group today, Morgan, the Trilateral DRFs. We've got North America, we've got Mexico, Canada, Europe, Asia. So you've got a great, sampling of the world to share some of these, messages and conversations with. Tell us, you've been on multiple trips with the Secretary. Bring us in on some of the side conversations. What are some of the trends that you are noticing, and are there any particular visits recently or in the beginning that have stood out?
Well, that's a super interesting question. I would say my last trip to the Middle East, we were in UAE, Bahrain. We went to Khartoum. They all start to run together. I got to think. Oh, we were in Israel, obviously, and Oman. What was
I love Oman.
Yeah, they're the nicest people.
Great place to visit.
Nicest people in the world. What was fascinating about being in UAE and Bahrain, and especially UAE, is how excited the average person was about the Abraham Accords. And, I think that Yusuf Ortagus, the ambassador here, for the UAE ambassador to the United States, and all the leadership in UAE, they definitely took a big risk on this, right? Like now it seems like, oh great, peace is breaking out with Israel in the Middle East. And it seems, and everyone said, oh, they've been working at this for years, right? It's so easy, except that, until you actually are the ones to get it done. And it's hard to be first, right? It's hard for the UAE to go out on the limb and to be the one that goes first. And then of course, Bahrain followed, and we hope others do as well. But for me, it was just so interesting, especially to young people, just this sense of excitement about, can I go to Tel Aviv? What does this mean for business? Can I travel back and forth? I felt in UAE and in Bahrain, I almost felt that the citizens were more excited about it than we were, if I thought that was possible. And I was, of course, in the Oval Office with the president and his team whenever he had the call. There was like on a Friday before, it was on a Friday before we had the Abraham Accords at the White House, and we had the call between the president and the King of Bahrain, and UAE. It wasn't the foreign minister. The foreign minister was here in person, so I think it was the Crown Prince. I think that's who was on. Oh no, I take that back. Sorry, it wasn't UAE. It was Israel. It was Israel. It was Netanyahu. It was the King Hamad of Bahrain and the president. And so that was the call where Bahrain and Israel, of course, established official recognition. So there's these moments, like there's really, honestly, and I think every single person who's been in my job before, no matter the administration, would say there's terrible moments. And then there's moments where you achieve something so historic that you never thought you'd be a part of in your lifetime. And it's just incredibly, incredibly surreal. So a lot of my side conversations that when we're traveling, I like to talk to our locally employed staff. I like to, of course, talk to my other counterparts, but for me, it's more interesting to talk to the people and to get their perspective on things. And so I would say, at least, and that was my last trip, but at least being in UAE, in Bahrain, and feeling the excitement and knowing that things will be forever different in the Middle East because of the Abraham Accords, kind of can't replace that one.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, returning to the Middle East now in this role and previously serving, in Saudi and traveling throughout the Gulf on behalf of Treasury, I'm just curious, when you were on the ground in Doha during the Taliban negotiations, what's going through your mind? I mean, you've been on the other side, you've been part of the sanctions efforts prior. I mean, what's that like for you to see the enforcement side and then to see negotiations take place with a foreign terrorist organization?
Well, technically, Michael, the Taliban was never designated as an FTO U.S. government. So just to be
Treasury may have wanted it, but right, exactly.
But just to be technical about it, that is really a great question. And I should write a book one day. I should think more about these things. So, Michael, I'm going to have to remember your questions. I mean, because you're right, because not only I'm in the Navy Reserves as an intel officer, and so no matter who wins the presidency, right, for me, I haven't been drilling for the past year and a half, what we call drilling, and I know we have some non-Americans on, which is, my reserve status. So, I'm one of the few people in Washington that works for, both sides. As I said, I work for the Obama administration with Michael. And no matter who wins, I put on my uniform and serve at the pleasure of that president in a reserve capacity, obviously. So on one hand, from a military perspective and a Treasury perspective with Michael, we have been going after the Taliban for a long time. And General Miller, who's in Afghanistan, is one of my favorite people on the planet and one of the most effective generals that we have had there. And of course, most of you who are from other countries are allies who've been in the fight with us, who've been there. But, you start looking at almost 2 decades of war and 2 decades of, at some point, you have to look at yourselves and say, we're not going to fight our way out of this, right? And so you look at the cost of American life, you look at the cost of taxpayer money that we're spending there. You look at the strategic implications of leaving, not just for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the area, but what it means for our presence in South Asia, writ large. So you start looking at all these things and making an assessment. And I think that, listen, there's not a political candidate, whether it's, and I don't get into the politics of things, but whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, there's really not anybody who was going to win their party's nomination that was going to commit to 10 more years in Afghanistan, right? That's not really where the American people are. So when you know that when both political parties in the United States and most Americans say we don't understand why we're still there and why we're spending this money, you start to look at the strategic calculation for being there. And for us, we just knew ultimately it came down to that after 2 decades of war, we weren't going to fight our way out of this. So we started looking with Zal Khalilzad, who is just an amazing, amazing diplomat, about how do we get to peace, something that seems, again, completely unachievable to anybody who's been working on Afghanistan for a long time. So Zal, actually, I was texting with Zal this morning. Zal is back in Doha, I believe today. He's back in Doha working with both sides. This is really what we're in right now, is intra-Afghan negotiations. This is really an Afghan led process. This is, we're there to support. Zal is there to support, but the only way we're ever going to get to peace is all the parties that we have at the table right now. We have women, we have civil society, we have the government of Afghanistan, we have the Taliban. We have people that hate each other and have been killing each other for a very long time, looking at each other. So I'll tell you very, very quickly, in February, I went to Doha when Secretary Pompeo signed the peace accords between the Taliban in the United States. And, to see the Taliban in person there, I mean, people that, from an intel and military perspective, I have worked to defeat, let's put it nicely. And so I think it's sort of like any end of conflict. When you see the person, when you stand next to the person that you've been at war with, for a long time, it's just it's very surreal. But then you also, I think, remember their humanity, as well. I mean, there was actually I won't say which one, but there was, one of the leaders, and we were sort of all standing off to the side. And I said to one of our translators that I'd like to talk to him, and I just want to thank them for being here today. And I want to tell them, that I hope they're serious about peace, because this is a historic moment. So I'm trying to talk to him, and he looks at me, and I mean, I'm 38. I don't even know. I doubt he was my age. Maybe he was. I think he was younger than me, but who knows? And he looked incredibly nervous that I came over to talk to him, and sort of started to run away from me. And I was like thinking to myself, like, what the hell? And then I said, does he not want to talk to me? He said, no, he wants to talk to you, but over in the corner. So essentially, here is this guy who is, a leader in the Taliban movement, pretty proficient guy on the battlefield, who was trying to run off into the corner because it was sort of like running from a girl, right? And then it sort of hit me at some point when I was walking off to the side with him. I thought, oh, like, he's not used to talking to girls. This is really funny. It's just like a very moment.
I'm sure you'll tell your daughter that story, Morgan.
Yeah.
Tell us a few more, then I want to jump into some issues on Europe and China and the Middle East. What's been the most difficult foreign policy issue this administration has had to deal with? And I guess in particular, from your side, I mean, from your role, what's been the most difficult issue? Has it been China? I mean, has it been the U.S.-China trade war, or is it other sensitive issues like hostages overseas where you can't really go into much information?
Well, Michael, you're my friend, Robert O'Brien, who's the National Security Advisor, who you and I have known for, a decade plus now, has been he was the hostage negotiator before that. So this administration has been incredibly effective on that. That's an interesting one to describe, because I could almost go through every single region and think of a place that's really hard. North Korea has definitely been a challenge. Steve Biegun, our Deputy Secretary of State, continues to work on that file. He was the envoy there as well. And so, listen, it's a great thing when they're not testing nuclear weapons. That's a good thing for the world. We've obviously tried a very different approach than any administration has taken before. And every approach, if you quantify it as what works and what doesn't work, right? Every approach that Republican and Democrat administrations took before this ultimately, didn't, and whether it took years for that to to play out, ultimately didn't work, so to speak. So, that one's been a challenge just because we've had to think about it in such a different way, and it affects so much. There's also, the Chinese have actually been helpful, as at many points, and as have the Russians, as it relates to, to North Korea. So that one, there is some successes there, that they're not testing and they're not threatening us or their neighbors. But obviously, we still expect Kim Jong-un to live up to the promises that he made to the president at both of their summits. So we're waiting on that. So that's incredibly challenging. What's been really challenging over the past year is the, probably dealing with Turkey as it relates to the S-400.
Yep.
Also, we have the challenges that are ongoing right now when you have Turkey and Greece. We're trying to mediate that dispute between two NATO allies, over the Eastern Mediterranean. So, there's always the challenge of trying to mediate and work diplomatically to work through issues. When you've got two enemy combatants, right? Like the Taliban and the government of Afghanistan. I mean, that's one of the hardest things that we've had to pursue. It's even harder than when you have two allies going at it, right? That brings on another set of challenges. But I will tell you that the thing that I feel good about with Mike Pompeo is that he hasn't been afraid to take on the hard stuff, right? No one wants to take on diplomacy in Afghanistan. No one wants to take on North Korea. No one wants to take on Middle East peace, right? I mean, and just in the sense that these are such massive issues that, you are set up for frustration and failure. But I'm proud of the secretary. I think that he's been given a big mandate by the president to execute and to think about these problems differently and to build a team that thinks about these problems differently.
I mean, just very quickly on North Korea, the leader there is taking an interesting strategy where he's actually admitting to his people some mistakes that he's made, where we haven't seen that before. I mean, just any thoughts on that from the North Korea watcher side?
So remember how we talked at the beginning of this discussion about how one of the most frustrating things are the things that I can't talk about? You could file.
That's one of them? Okay. Well, I'll move on to the national security strategy then. So sure. That strategy the administration rolled out highlighted that we're in an era of great power competition. And, Morgan, over the next 5 to 10 years after this administration or during this next administration, how do you see the competition evolving within great power competition?
Great question. So national security strategy, I mean, all of you are fellows, so you probably all know this or were even involved in them, is typically done at the beginning of a new president's term. We really saw a very dynamic shift in this national security strategy, where for the Bush and Obama administrations, for obvious reasons, very focused on counterterrorism and that mandate, and everything that fell under that mandate around the world, and that makes sense, right? Like as it should. So this, I think, national security strategy, which is incredibly well written, incredibly great, very good team who did this, focused obviously on the shift, as Michael said, to great power competition between China, Russia, and the United States. And I think that you have seen that played out in everything we do. On the Russia file right now in Helsinki is Marshall Billingsley, who's our negotiator, who is working on New START. And we're not going to just, in this administration is at least, not going to just reflexively extend New START. We're working on a number of upgrades to that agreement, and hopefully multilateralizing, to use a diplomatic word, that agreement, and bringing in the Chinese. So there's very active, very heavy negotiations going on the scenes behind that. And as it relates to China, the trade news takes up a ton of that space. But we've done a lot of things like, officially stating our policy on the South China Sea, standing up for our allies and friends in the region that are often bullied by the CCP, and that's why, listen, during this time, I got a lot of questions from reporters over the weekend. Are you guys still going to Japan? And obviously, the secretary is on his way there now to meet with the Quad, which we think is one of the most important meetings that we have all year, right? I mean, it's just so important to be there. with our Indo-Pacific allies and friends and partners. I don't know that there's anything more important in our strategy of, countering the Chinese Communist Party, probably than that Quad meeting. So that was crucial for the secretary to go. Anyway, sorry, I feel like I rambled, Michael.
No, that was good. Just on China, I mean, we all talk about the competition that's happening constantly and the rhetoric increasing. Where is the area of cooperation that hasn't changed with the U.S. and China, that staying consistent?
So I think, I don't want to speak too much on the North Korea file, but I think Steve Biegun would say that he feels like that the Chinese have been helpful there. So that's, that's one area. And listen, we did finish the phase 1 trade deal, right? I mean, that was a long time in negotiating. That was a long time in coming. We still have tons of American businesses who are doing business in China, Chinese business who are here. So there's not sort of, this sense of, it's not like the Cold War. People often compare it to the Cold War, and I think that's a sort of a wrong comparison, because the Soviet Union was never, invested in the United States, and the United States, from a business perspective, was never invested in the Soviet Union the way that we are in China. So I think that trade talks, and again, this is more the portfolio of USTR, not necessarily of the State Department, but I think that those trade talks will continue in the next round, and that'll probably, if President Trump is reelected, or President Biden as well, I think I would assume that that's something that anybody working on China is going to want to pursue, because the business interests are between the two countries are not going away, and that's why I think that's one of the crucial factors where it's different from the Cold War, that I think people sort of hype and oversell it.
So one more question on China. I mean, the secretary's been very active with the Israelis on their relationship with China, and take us into very sensitive conversations, because Israel needs to play all sides. They need to be the intermediary. They've got economic, security, relationships with China. The United States is trying to obviously push the world away from Huawei and other technologies. Where is the happy medium in that relationship?
So I'm obviously very careful at trying to describe the conversations between the secretary and his counterparts in any country, including Israel. I will say that when we talk to Israel about China, and we talk to them very bluntly about it, we talk to them the same way that we talk to the United Kingdom or Argentina or Germany or whomever it may be. We respect every country's sovereignty and every country's ability to do their own risk assessment as it relates to Huawei, for example, and to come to the same conclusion that our experts have come to as it relates to the risks from Huawei. We also talk to the fact to the Israelis, for example, and to other countries. Our message is strikingly similar. I mean, in every meeting that I'm in with the president, with the secretary, we could be in Portugal or we could be in Israel, and the message is the same. It's not really, tailored to a specific country, but we say to our allies and friends, listen, we got this wrong for a long time as well, right? We have Huawei in rural infrastructure in the United States, and we're still trying to get to remove those systems as well. We just passed the NDAA. I think it was last year's NDAA, maybe the year before, but it's a very recent NDAA that we passed that banned Huawei technologies from being used in critical infrastructure, especially in our Defense Department, State Department, security apparatus. So it's not like we did that 10 years ago, right? Secretary Pompeo says, listen, we were all asleep at the wheel together for a long time, but now we have technical experts who are assessing this through a risk-based approach, look at this and say, you know what, there's no way to share, to have Huawei in your systems and to be able to confidently share intelligence information, for example. So we've spoken about that quite publicly. We also talk a lot about, the Belt and Road Initiative in many ways is nothing more than debt trap diplomacy with projects that don't often meet the type of environmental and industrial standards that American or Canadian or European companies would adhere to. So again, we don't go around to countries. I've never been in a meeting with Secretary Pompeo where he goes to a country and says, you must do X, you must get rid of this, you must not do that. We simply present the facts. We present the risk assessment that and the thoughts that we have come to, our conclusions, and we ask their technical experts to do the same thing. And that's why I think you have seen so many countries that have joined us in this, what we call the 5G Clean Initiative, whether it's clean countries, clean telecoms. Keith Kroc, our undersecretary for the Economic Bureau at the State Department, is working with telecom companies around the world that are pledging to be clean telcos. So there's a lot of information out there. I could probably go on that for about an hour, so I'll stop.
No, I'm sure you could. We've got around less than 10 minutes. I got 3 questions to go, Morgan. On Europe, how concerned are you about a post-Merkel Europe? And who do you think will take her mantle, if anyone? And how will that impact future U.S.-EU ties?
So I'm not going to get into who the German people are going to decide to be their leader. I struggle with politics in the United States and predicting that. I'm out of the prediction game anywhere. I will say that that no country, there's no leader that's bigger than their own country, right? That includes the United States as well. The German, United States, US-EU Transatlantic Alliance has been around before all of our current leaders. It'll be around a lot after, it will be around longer, especially with Germany. In addition to the military, economic, diplomatic ties that our countries have, huge people-to-people ties, huge German-American population. So, I'm not at all worried about the relationship, and I'm certainly not worried about the future of Germany post-Merkel. We've met with a ton of their leaders. I mean, Germany's an incredibly sophisticated country, and there's always great leaders around the planet, and you wonder, oh gosh, how will XYZ go on without them? But I often remind myself, sometimes I get caught up in this job and I think, oh my God, how am I going to go on maternity leave in a few weeks here? What about this? What about that? And right. I often remind myself that, someone once told me that graveyards are full of indispensable people. So I don't
know if you're indispensable, Morgan. I would never use that to describe you, but take to Iran. The administration's been going on a maximum pressure campaign.
Yeah.
As someone who used to serve at Treasury, you're very aware of how the United States and all administrations since 9/11 have exercised the power of the U.S. dollar and the U.S. economic system to really pressure countries, specifically Iran. Talk to us about that and that weaponization.
Yeah, so when we looked at removing ourselves from the JCPOA, one of the main things, and I think there was a lot that went into the assessment of whether to say that or not. That actually happened right before, I'm trying to remember the year. Anyway, that happened right when Secretary Pompeo started. So that was definitely before my time. So I wasn't in those discussions, but I do know that one of the big problems, one of the failings that we think of the JCPOA is the billions of dollars in sanctions relief that was given to Iran. And I actually think that Tom Friedman from the New York Times did a fantastic column on this after Soleimani's death. I'd have to look, I need to go back and reread that column, but he essentially, he called him like, I got to go back and read the column, but everybody should Google and read it. It was a fantastic column. But he detailed, probably better than we have, the number of ways in which the IRGC Quds Force and Soleimani Iran had this historic opportunity where the whole point of the JCPOA was, we're going to give you these billions of dollars of sanctions relief, and then you're going to start coming back into the international order, right? You're going to start doing business with American and European companies. You're going to come back and you're going to be a normal nation and be a part of this process. So that was the theory, and that theory didn't prove out. What we in fact know is instead of spending this money on, hospital or public health infrastructure or roads or schools or any of this stuff, that money was sent to Iran's Shia terrorist proxy groups around the region, right? Look at Lebanon is a mess, right? Because of Hezbollah, Syria, Yemen, the Houthis, right? they have given them such incredibly sophisticated weaponry. They bombed the Saudis, right, and took the Saudi oil market off. Production off, excuse me, temporarily. So, if I had 20 more minutes, I could sit here and think of every single way in which they exploited. So we essentially looked and said, the only way that we can get to a new and better deal and negotiate for a better JCPOA is if we have leverage, right? If we have a better bargaining position, and as long as they're doing business with European American companies, and as long as they're getting billions of dollars in sanctions relief, they have no incentive to come to the table. They have no incentive to curb their malign behavior. Listen, I wish that the people who negotiated the JCPOA were correct. I wish that Iran had made the strategic calculation to not pursue a ballistic missile weapons program that could threaten the entire region, to not put these Kataib Hezbollah and Asab al-Haq in Iraq, for example, and we could go through all the various proxy groups. I wish that they had decided not to, to put these groups on fire. In terms of the amount of money and aid and lethal support that they gave them. I wish they took the opportunity for the Iranian people to say, you know what, we're gonna put the Iranian people first. We're going to pursue, the best economic situation for Iran, the best business deals for Iran. They could have chosen to do all of that. I wish for the Iranian people that they would have. That would have been a better life for the Iranian people, but they didn't.
So Morgan, last question. I know your team is telling you have to go. So last question on Venezuela.
Oh.
On Venezuela, what does success look like here? I mean, what do you think is tangibly possible that that can be called an achievement? And in this regard, talk about whether we're overusing economic sanctions, whether we're overusing the dollar, because it does have a very strong impact, but there are limits sometimes. So just talk about those two things.
Well,
two light issues to wrap it up, Morgan.
What success looks like is the restoration of democracy in Venezuela. That's success. Maduro is not a legitimately elected leader in Venezuela. That's why the United States and I believe almost 60 nations have recognized Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela. So that's the ultimate success. And actually, there's a lot of, if there's not, the one problem with the way the media reports right now, and all of us, it's not just the media, I don't want to blame them, but all of us, we're used to such instant gratification on Twitter and on social media that we forget that diplomacy and these sorts of things take time. So if Maduro doesn't fall overnight somehow the policy isn't working, which, I just disagree with. Ultimately, the Venezuelan people deserve a return to real democracy. They deserve to have free and fair elections, and they don't deserve to be, ruled by a dictator who has put them in such a perilous condition for so many years, right? This is even prior to U.S. sanctions, just completely running the economy into the ground. So this coalition, despite some of the criticisms, has really held up. I mean, when we go to Latin America, South America, and when we go to Colombia and we're meeting with all of these people, I can't tell you how aggressive and determined these allies are to stick with this policy, because they understand better than all of us what it's like to be a neighbor to Maduro, what it's like for the Venezuelan people. So we're going to continue to call and continue to work within all of the various frameworks that we have to call for the restoration of real and true democracy in Venezuela. Then the second part of your question is about sanctions and maybe their overuse. I think I started in government at the last couple of years at the end of the Bush administration. And I'll tell you that we have had, for 14, 15 years now, we have had this discussion about the overuse of sanctions and what it means. I will tell you from the perspective of for us, when we pulled out of the JCPOA and started the maximum economic pressure campaign against Iran, we were told that unilateral U.S. sanctions would never work. And they did.
Well, Morgan, thank you so much for the conversation today. I am so glad that we were able to have this together. before your baby arrives. And
Thanks.
so
I wish
thank
you
you. I look forward to it. And everyone, thank you for joining us today on behalf of Megan O'Sullivan and Richard Fontaine, my counterpart Cassandra at North America Trilateral Commission. We look forward to having more of these conversations with all of you. If there are particular topics or speakers you'd like us to bring together, we look forward to that. And again, Morgan, please have a safe rest of the month and best of luck with everything moving forward.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks, everybody.
More.